Welcome back, and this is our third presentation on Norse mythology, introducing you to some of the concepts that will be useful for reading some of our texts, the Eddas and the sagas and all that kind of stuff. In our previous presentations, we looked at the mythic landscape, the cosmology presented by those texts, and we also looked at the nature of the gods and goddesses, how they're actually deployed, described, and so forth in the sagas and the Eddas. And this time what we're going to do is we're going to look at the cult of the gods in Norse culture. And what I mean by the cult of the gods is how the culture surrounding the gods comes out in the Poetic Edda, what people might have expected in their society regarding the gods. Remember that the word culture itself comes from a future participle of the Latin word colere, which means to tend or worship. So it's to venerate something, it's to tend to it, it's to cultivate it in many different ways. So culture is always something which is about to be tended or developed or somehow produced by the people who participate in that culture. The word cult comes from the past participle, cultus, that which has been tended or venerated, that which has been produced in that cultural way. So cult and culture are both intertwined. It's just cult tends to be in the sort of past tense. In our modern language, the word cult has a negative connotation because it's been associated with religious practice, with religious practice that is considered socially unacceptable. But in an academic context, the word cult simply means the religious observation surrounding a particular religion. And remember that the literature that we're talking about here is Old Norse literature from 800 to 1400. And I go through this a little bit more fully in the first presentation, but I wanted to show these again because it's worthwhile noting that the literature that we're talking about is a literature in transition. It's moving from the older Viking Age literature of the 9th and 10th centuries, and it's now moving into a more Christianized literature of the 12th and 13th centuries. And what we see is a corresponding shift in how the tropes we're going to talk about get deployed. They're very much there, and you will see them coming up again and again, but it's worth keeping in mind that this is a literature in transition. It's also worth keeping in mind that a lot of our cosmological understanding comes from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, and this was actually written in the first part of the 13th century, and it shows a certain amount of Christian focus. So even though it's very, very useful in looking back at the cult of the Norse gods as they were prior to the conversion, it's still a little bit problematic because it's very hard to see where the sort of Christian side of it begins and the pre-Christian side of it ends. So this is all to say, just take all of this with a grain of salt, and when you go back and read the literature, you'll see how this all plays out. Okay, so let's go ahead and just jump into this. So, Cultus Deorum, the cult of the gods. And what we mean here, of course, is those tropes, topoi, and idioms that focus around the religious conception of the gods and how they integrate with human society. That's really what we're talking about. And so the first topic that naturally comes to mind is sacrifice, and this comes up again and again and again in so many different ways. The term sacrifice, again, comes from Latin. It means to make something sacer, and this goes back to the threefold conception of how divinity interacts with human society, and we'll get to that in a little bit. The second topic that I want to talk about is oath-taking, because this was a major, major part of Norse society. In fact, in almost every heroic society, oath-taking was of almost almost incredible importance. In other words, it's hard to believe how important oath-taking was. And then the third topic that I want to talk about is riddling culture, and this is more than just telling riddles and trying to solve riddles. It's an entire hermeneutic process that is one way that in Norse culture and in other cultures as well, you find it in Celtic culture as well, the ability to look past appearances and to solve, to have that hermeneutic moment, that aha, that's what we're really talking about. So riddling is very important. But first, let's talk about the culture of sacrifice. Now, many traditional cultures, there's a great article on this in the Journal of Indo-European Studies, which details it in the Indo-European cultures, but it's almost certain that this can be you can find this in other cultures as well, that there's a threefold notion of how the divine interacts with human society. And the one way, and it relates to three different Latin terms: sacer, Augustus, and Sanctus. And if something is sacer, it's not for human consumption. It is not of this world. And as something not of this world, it needs to be kept away from or kept in its own little place. It's the idea of forbidden knowledge, forbidden fruit. It's the idea of you have to purify yourself in order to even come close to it. You find it in classical Greek culture, where, if Zeus shows himself in all of his glory, you will literally be fried and just roasted alive, because it's the gods, it's too much for us. That's the idea of sacer. And when you make a sacrifice, sacrificia, what you get is the taking of something every day and setting it aside for the gods. That's what sacrifice properly means. The other two ideas here are Augustus is something which is filled with divinity, and thus it becomes sort of super normal. It's the idea of a heroic leader, and this is the idea in Roman religion where the emperor becomes a religiously venerated figure. They are Augustus. They are filled with that divine power. Augury is the skill of seeing where divine power has come into the natural world, either through looking at birds and haruspexy, or looking at the motions of clouds, or any sort of omen is augury. So if you think about Augustus, someone who is filled with divine power, augury, seeing divine power in things, and you think of our term to augment something, it is to put more power into it, more of that divine quality. And to inaugurate someone into a position of office is to then imbue them with that supernormal divine whatnot. The final one, Sanctus, where we get the word saint from, means something which has been brought into right relationship with the divine through ritual. And that's really what we're kind of talking about here. And in Norse culture, it's the blot. The blot is really the primary religious ritual in pre-Christian Norse culture. And the blot, there are many different kinds of blots. You can have them as a sort of circumstantial situation where it's like, oh, we need a blot right now. Or you have set blots throughout the year. Alsa blot, the blot in honor of all the Aesir, the Alpha blot, the blot that is in honor of the elves, the Thor blot, which is in honor of Thor, and so on and so forth. These are fixed, movable in the modern sense, but they're set blots that are celebrated at set times of the year. If we think about all of our traditions around, Christmas now, but Yule, you think about the Yule log, you think about greening the house, you think about the giving of presents. These all go back to the Yule blot, which occurred right around the winter solstice. The blot as a ritual involved animal sacrifice and feasting, oath-taking, and so it really was a kind of socially formative ritual. It was led by a Goli, and a Goli is someone who is very especially in Iceland, it was someone who was very, very prominent in society, who was already quite powerful, and they sort of there was no established priest structure that we can see in pre-Christian Norse religion. So it was led by someone who just had the honor of doing it. So let's get into the structure. What actually happens in a blot? In a blot, what we have first is the sacrifice. And the sacrifice is where you take an animal. It seems to have been usually a cow of some kind, but we're also told that it could have been a horse. And I suppose it's conceivable that there would have been other animals as well. But it always starts with a ritual killing. And in that ritual killing, an animal is led up to the high place, the sort of altar type area, and killed there. Their blood is spilled onto the altar. A sacred branch is sort of swept around in it to collect the blood, and then for lack of a better term, congregation is sort of sprinkled. They're aspergated with the blood. This is an important part of the sacrifice. And you see this first part of the sacrifice has some very important ramifications. For example, it was considered a really, really bad omen if you stumbled on the way up to this high place. If you were approaching the high place and you fell, it was considered an omen of your forthcoming death. So after the sacrifice, after the ritual killing, you get the blessing with the branch. Everyone gets sort of sprinkled with the blood. And then everyone goes inside and there's a feast held. And the feast is very, very important. And the idea that seems to be happening here is that at the feast, the gods and the divine society and the human society are all interacting. This also goes for the Alpha Blot. You've got the elves there with you feasting as well. So the blood is a socially formative event. And one of the things that happens at that socially formative event is oath-taking. Once everybody has eaten, once everybody has feasted together, you have oath-taking. And you can see this really playing out in an important way in funerals, where when the head of a family passes away and one of the sons is going to step up and take their place, the head of the family's seat is left empty. Nobody gets to sit there until the blot in their honor. And then whoever's going to take their place comes up, and of course they've all got their drinking horns. Vikings did not always drink out of drinking horns. They weren't using drinking horns because they didn't have anything else to use. They used drinking horns because cattle were associated with wealth and with prosperity and abundance. And what you did was you filled the drinking horn with the mead, the sort of divine elixir of mantic knowledge and sovereignty. And then you make your oath on the mead, swearing by whichever gods you wish to swear by. And the young, the person who's going to take the place in the family puts his foot onto the footstool, lifts up the horn, and swears an oath saying what he has done and what he's going to do in the position. This is very, very important. And then drinks the whole horn down. Most horns hold a little bit over a pint, so it's not really that big a deal. Some horns can be quite large, though, so hard to tell what sort of horns they were using in those situations. And then everybody would go around and everybody would take oaths. And this was considered, again, a very socially formative event. So you have this progression from the sacrifice of the animal through the blessing of everybody, the partaking in the ritual dining, and then finally the oath-taking, which then connects past to the future and all this kind of a business. So you have all elements of the cosmology recognized in this situation. There are enormous ramifications to this, which we don't have time to go into right now. And if it seems like this is something which is locked away in the past, you have to keep in mind that many of our traditions nowadays still maintain this structure. If you think about a rehearsal dinner for a wedding, you go and you have, or better yet, the reception afterwards. You have the marriage, which is the religious ceremony. You have everybody retreating back to a place where there is dining, and then afterwards, everybody gets up and gives their various speeches. It's no longer oath-taking, but it's now still a formality where the groom has to say something, the father has to say something. Everybody involved in the marriage has to get up and say something, and after every single time someone says something, everybody takes a drink. It's still there. It's still there. So the blot is a very, very important part of Norse culture, which then bears on modern society even to this day. Okay, so you can also have occasional sacrifices. Now, this is different from a blot. The blot has a very specific structure, but there are many, many kinds of sacrifice in Norse culture. And one of the ones that we commonly see is a sacrifice to Odin made in order to ensure success in battle. And it's usually involving a threefold death. So somebody is hanged, somebody is impaled on a spear, and sometimes even burned. It depends. In one saga, a king decides that he's going to make a sacrifice to Odin, but he's not really sure how to do it. So Odin actually shows up in disguise. Nobody knows that it is he, and he actually advises how to make this sacrifice to himself. And it turns out that he says, okay, you're going to draw lots, and one of you is going to be the sacrifice, and you're going to draw lots to do it. And of course, it turns out being the king. So the king is like, well, I don't know, I'm not sure how we're going to do this. And Odin says, well, don't worry about it. We're going to make it's just going to be gestural. We're going to make the noose out of a little bit of grass. We're going to use a little tiny twig as the spear, and instead of a fire, you're going to have just a little bucket of water. And then, of course, at the moment of sacrifice, when it all happens, the grass turns into a stout rope, the twig turns into a spear, and the bucket turns into burning flames or whatever it is. And we know that threefold death, sacrifice of this kind, actually happened because we found bogmen that have been garroted, stabbed, and then drowned in a bog. So we know that it was at least an old practice. The historicity of it in the saga era is a little bit less well attested, but it's there anyways in the sagas. One of the more infamous occasional sacrifices that you get is called the blood eagle, and the blood eagle is where you humiliate your foe by putting them down on the ground face down, hacking through their rib cage with your axe and pulling their lungs out, so that they look like they're an eagle with the wings spread out. And for a long time, this was thought to have been a literary motif and not actually practiced, until they actually found the remains of a body off the west coast of Scotland that this had actually been done to. So it at least happened once. So, all right. So let's go back to oath-taking. And we know that we've already covered the blot and the role of oath-taking in the blot. Swearing by the gods was fantastically important. And we know that it was considered, each god had its own character of oaths. One of the examples that we can have, I can mention, is Odin's oath. And Odin's oath comes up in several different contexts. One of them comes from a poem from the Orkney Islands called the Lay of the Lady Odavir. And in that, a guy takes Odin's oath that he's going to win this young woman's heart and marry her. And he does, to incredibly ill effect. So you have to be careful the kind of oaths you take. It's a very sort of monkey's paw kind of situation where you have to be careful what you wish for. You'll get it, but there's going to be a major price. Odin, at guaranteeing success in battle, always comes with a very, very steep price. But you see it coming up elsewhere as well. In one of the other sagas, a landowner decides to take Freyr as his tutelary god, and so takes an oath that nobody will ride a particular horse. Well, of course, somebody winds up riding a horse, and everything goes really, really horribly for him. So oath-taking was phenomenally important. And it's worth getting into more, but for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and move on. So riddling culture. Now riddling culture is one of the more tantalizing, but one of the more enjoyable elements of Norse culture. And one of the ways that it comes out is in poetic diction. And in poetic diction, what we find is circumlocution and kennings. And what we mean by circumlocution is that the poets will not actually tell you precisely what it is they're talking about. They'll sort of dance around it. They'll go around in circles. They will go, yeah, anyway, they will circumlocute. And then this leads to kennings. And kennings are a form of formalized riddle in poetry. And the way this works is that you will get something you will get something in a poem that doesn't really make much sense, but if you think it through and figure out the riddle, it then makes perfect sense. And here's an example. All right. No terror of the serpent's lair ever saw more war skis of storms. This comes from a poem in the 13th century celebrating a nautical attack made on the Western Isles of Scotland by a Norwegian king. And if you think about no terror of the serpent's lair, I've already given you the solution right there in front of you. But what you have to understand here is that the serpent refers to a dragon. So no terror of the serpent's lair. Serpent is a dragon. So who is it that frightens dragons? Well, it's obviously the one who's going to take the dragon's gold, because dragons hoard gold. Well, the one who invades to get the gold, what's he going to do with the gold? Well, he's going to give away the gold. See, a dragon keeps the gold all to himself. What makes a dragon is his greed and his avarice, his hoarding. What makes a king is his ability to procure abundance for his people. So a king gives away gold in order to form social bonds. And so the terror of the serpent's lair, the one who truly terrifies a dragon, is the one who is the dispenser of gold, who gives gold and forms society. And that's a lord, that's a king. So no terror of the serpent's lair, no lord ever saw more war skis of storms. Okay, so war ski of storms. What we're talking about is storms on the ocean. Vikings were kind of obsessed with the ocean. And you use skis to sort of to slide over the drifts of snow. So you think of drifts of snow as waves on the ocean, the skis go over them. Well, obviously it's a ship. So we're talking about warships. So when the poet says, no terror of the serpent's lair ever saw more war skis of storms, what we're really talking about is no lord ever saw more ships. And those are kennings. And there are set kennings, and there are kennings that are invented on the spot. Kennings are riddles embedded in the diction of a poem. And what Snorri Sturluson saw happening in the early 13th century was people were forgetting the stories that made it possible to solve kennings. All right, there's another way that riddling culture comes out in the Cultus Deorum in Norse culture, and that's through trolls and shapeshifting. Now, when you think about shapeshifting, we tend to think of it more in terms of magic. You are warping an otherwise immutable reality. But reality for people in the Middle Ages was almost infinitely mutable. It was always in flux. It was always changing. And your ability to predict those changes or to see past those changes, was what really separated the intelligent from the unintelligent. So shape-shifting was not so much a change of essential nature. It's more, shape-shifting represents the ability to hide what really is there. So something could show up as a person. Someone could show up as a human being, but you could be actually talking to an elf, or you could be talking to a giant. It just depends, because shape is completely fluid. So in order to figure out who something really is, you see this coming out with Odin all the time. He's always disguising himself and going around. Odin is the hermeneutic god. He's the god who represents the ability to see past appearances and to take action to gain victory on the basis of that. So he's always disguising himself and mucking about with people's histories. You have to be intelligent enough to put together the clues to see who that is. Trolls are the same way. There's a tradition in Norway where the troll wives, in some traditions they have cloven hooves, in some traditions they have cow tails. But there's always some indication that you're not talking with a regular person. The one you're talking to is actually a troll. And if you're talking to a troll, they're probably going to try and lure you out into the forest and eat you. It just depends. So what we see here is riddles being tied to the ability to see past false appearances. But then they're also used as a way to solve the sorts of problems. You'll get traditions where, for example, there's a story where a young girl is tending the baby of the family one night, and a troll comes up to the window saying, "Give me the baby to eat him." And she says, "Well, let's have a riddling competition." And the troll can't resist, and so they start a riddling competition. They go back and forth. And of course, you'll recognize this from J.R.R. Tolkien's Hobbit, where Gollum and Bilbo Baggins get into a riddling competition down there in the dark. It's the same exact idea. This is where he got it from. And of course, eventually, the troll is delayed so long by the riddling competition that the sun comes up and he turns to stone. Again, a motif that Tolkien used in The Hobbit. So riddling is both a way of sort of training yourself to see past appearances and see what is really there in reality, and it's also a way to sort of solve those sorts of problems in reality. And what we see happening with the riddling competition as well is the dialogue. A riddle is fundamentally a hermeneutic moment in a conversation. There's always an asker and an answerer. There's always this questioning and response. And this is probably one of the reasons why catechesis in Northern European society within Celtic and in Norse culture caught on so well. What I'm talking about is the practice of indoctrinating people through questions and answers, through dialogue. And you see this, there's a whole thing about it. Anyway, so there's our three different topics: sacrifice, oath-taking, and riddling. And as you go through the sagas and the Eddas, you'll see them coming up again and again and again. If by now you've forgotten what the first presentation covered, I recommend you go back and look at it again. Better yet, go and read some Eddas, read some of the sagas, and then come back and listen to these again, and you'll see really what I mean. So thanks very much for listening.